Hey, welcome to Grille Cloth Recordings. In this video, you'll see how I made these amp-style hexagonal acoustic panels from scrap material I had laying around my studio, which cost me about $3.50 each to make. The hex design was inspired by material that would otherwise be unusable. I had these long 10-foot sections of 3/4 inch by 4 inch dimensional pine, but they were so twisted and warped, I had to cut them down into shorter lengths. These shorter lengths, when alternated during glue-up, create a much more stable shape. And since I was stuck to making smaller panels anyway, I decided that hexagons would look good in my studio. With the scrap material I had, which also included some awkwardly sized Grille Cloth left over from some 1x12 cabinet builds, I had enough to make 6 panels. And with my tight margin for error, I kept the construction relatively simple. A main outer frame and the inner frame, which is wrapped in Grille Cloth. So let's start with the main frame. After cutting them down to length, I cut a rabbet on each side, which would create a shelf for the inner frame to be secured to the front and a fabric backing to be secured in the rear of the panel to house the absorption material. These dimensions aren't critical, but I decided to cut the rabbet to 3/8 of an inch by 1 1/4 inches so that the inner frame would look proportional when attached. Because of the high amount of material I had to hog out for these cuts, I decided to use the table saw instead of a router, which gave me these really satisfying and useful offcuts that I'll save for a future project. By the way, the second set of hands you see is my grandfather, who is visiting from out of state and who I haven't seen in a really long time. He was influential in teaching me about music and woodworking and generally about life, so doing this project with him made it much more valuable and sentimental. Once cutting the rabbets, I went back to the miter saw to cut the 30-degree miter that creates the hexagonal shape when joined together. The inner frame is constructed by 1 inch wide sections of that same dimensional pine, and although it's much simpler than the main frame, getting the size just right was a bit tricky. Here you see me ripping some 1 inch sections of pine and cutting them down to their approximate length. Once roughed down, I trimmed and test fitted into the main frame until it left about an 1/8 inch gap around the entire edge while still catching on the shelf we made earlier on the main frame sections. This point in the build was really satisfying because it was the first time that the physical object I was conceptualizing in my head began to come to life, and I was really excited about how it would. I was really pleased with how uniform each piece was. They all fit together equally well, which made the rest of the build much easier because I didn't need to keep track of specific frame pairs. The final part of the frame construction is attaching the French cleat to the backside so that they can be mounted on the wall. While I'm not going to go into detail about how to make a French cleat in this video, I'll link a video down below that I found really helpful. Of note, I made the width such that I had some flexibility to slide these left and right to get the spacing right on the wall, but not so much that they would fall off. Although we alternated boards during the glue up, there were still some minor misalignments on some of the joints, not to mention some character spots in the wood that had to be filled. I made my own wood filler using sawdust I collected from these boards and Titebond 3 glue. This is my preferred method to filling gaps because it's relatively cheap, extremely strong, and is the least conspicuous after finishing. I'll leave another link down below that I found helpful in making your own wood filler. After letting the wood filler dry, I hand sanded the visible faces on the inside and used a random orbital sander to sand all of the outside faces down to 220 grit. Then, in order to replicate a common amp design feature, I rounded off the front outside edges using an 1/8 inch roundover bit and left the front inner edges squared off. This is a subtle but important detail that I think really ties the amp theme together. While the sawdust was still settling in my garage, I made essentially stain swatches of the few old cans of stain I had lying around, which I used to pair different Grille Cloth patterns to each stain. These were all really old and almost gone, so I figured I'd use what I can from these stain cans and toss the rest. Luckily, I had just enough from these 3 cans to stain all 6 panels. Up to this point, everything used to build these acoustic panels had been scrap left over from my garage, until now. I bought a couple new cans of clear coat because we had come way too far to let an old gunky can of polyurethane ruin this project. With bare or stained wood projects like this one, I generally build up coats until it loses its wood texture and feels smooth to the touch. These panels took 3 coats with light scuffing in between each one. Since Grille Cloth has some transparency, I painted the inner frame black so it wouldn't be visible from the front. I had just enough of this black spray paint left over from my overhead studio rig build, which is linked down below. Once they dried, I fastened black fabric to the back, again to limit visibility through the front, and then began to stretch the Grille Cloth over the other side of the inner frame. Stretching Grille Cloth over a hexagonal shape is really not that much different than a rectangle. Just a few more staples and a couple more chances for it to get crooked. I start with the bottom edge, then stretch and secure it to the opposite edge, then continue working through opposite edges, working from the middle out to the corners. I check the alignment often until all the edges are secure. Next, with the corners still loose, I pinch and fold the Grille Cloth over itself, forming a neat corner seam. In order to attach the inner and outer frames, I used adhesive so I didn't have any fasteners visible from the outside. In hindsight, I probably could have gotten away with hot glue, but I went way overkill and bought this construction adhesive that's advertised to bond to wood and more. At just over $8 for the tube, this was the most expensive component for the entire build, but it was enough for all 6 panels. By the way, I did some copious testing beforehand and was pleased with the results. Despite the higher cost, it was worth the peace of mind. The absorption material probably deserves a video on its own, but I'll briefly describe how I resource it, and provide you with some cheap or even free alternatives. While it would be easy to buy some rock wool or Owens Corning, it would have been expensive and I would have had a ton of material left over. And remember, the whole point of this project was to get rid of scrap material laying around and not to add to it. Instead, we went to a place that my grandfather and I like to call the Italian hardware store. Luckily, there's one right around the corner, and it was freshly stocked with carpet underlay. After browsing the aisle and only finding small offcuts, which would have made packing the panels pretty tricky, we asked one of the crew members if he had anything in the back, and he graciously gave us some larger sections that he had left over from recarpeting a house close by. As with anything you find in this kind of hardware store, make sure to give it a thorough smell and taste test before using it in your project. Finally, once all 6 panels were packed, I secured the back with more of that black fabric. For those of you who may not have a local Italian hardware store, another budget option for your absorption material is ripped up old t-shirts, rags, and blankets. I keep an assortment of these in my shop and considered using them before finding the carpet under. Of note, and I think this is really important, these panels will be mounted on the rear wall of my studio in a location and configuration similar to that of a diffuser. In positions where absorption is critical, such as the first reflection points in close proximity to the listening position, like the front and side walls, I recommend using higher quality and uniform material to provide you a more balanced response in your space. But again, because of the location of these panels, these will work well for me. Let us know what you're working on in your studio, and check out these other projects. Thanks for watching.